You already know Miles Morales. You fell in love with him in Into the Spider-Verse. Maybe you cried at the sequel. Maybe you played the PlayStation game at 2 in the morning and didn't stop until the credits rolled. And at some point you thought, I should read the comics. So you looked him up and you found 14 years of series, universe transplants, reboots, crossover events, and you had no idea where to start. Well, here's the answer, and I have to warn you, it's not the one you want. The best Miles Morales comic ever written is from a universe Marvel destroyed 13 years ago, and everything since has been the search, sometimes brilliant, sometimes maddening, for how to get back there. Today we're going writer by writer through the whole thing, every run, every near miss, every time Marvel got close and then pulled the rug. And by the end, you're going to understand something about Miles Morales that most comic readers have completely missed, something that changes the whole picture. Let's go. When Miles Morales was created in 2011, he didn't exist in the main Marvel universe. He lived somewhere else entirely, a separate reality called the Ultimate Universe. Think of it as Marvel's alternate timeline, a world that launched in 2000 where every classic character, Spider-Man, Captain America, the X-Men, was completely rebuilt from scratch for a modern audience. Different rules, but real stakes. Characters could actually die and stay dead. And then in 2011, the Ultimate Spider-Man, the Peter Parker version, did exactly that. He died. For real. The universe needed a new Spider-Man. So writer Michael Bendis had been writing Ultimate Spider-Man for over a decade. He knew this world better than anyone, and the character he created to carry the torch wasn't inspired by a comic book concept, it was inspired by a casting controversy. When Sony was casting The Amazing Spider-Man, fans online launched a campaign for actor Donald Glover to play Peter Parker. Glover didn't get the role, but Bendis had been watching the conversation, and he started asking himself a question: what if the next Spider-Man looked like someone who had never been Spider-Man before? That question is where Miles was born. The origin Bendis built is more emotionally complicated than anything in classic Spider-Man mythology. Miles didn't get his powers from a random accident. He gets bitten by a spider that was smuggled out of Oscorp by his Uncle Aaron, a career criminal who called himself the Prowler. That's worth actually stopping on for a minute. The person who gave Miles his powers is someone he loves, someone who shows up to family dinners, someone he doesn't want to become. That tension between the hero Miles is reaching for and the criminal legacy he's already tangled in is built into the character's DNA from page 1. And then Bendis does something superhero comics almost never do. He slows down and lets Miles be scared. Miles gets his powers, but he panics. He tells his best friend Genki, and then he does nothing. He doesn't want to be a hero, he's a kid. It takes watching Peter Parker die in front of him, standing there with powers he could have used and choosing not to finally force him into the costume. That's not the Uncle Ben lesson Peter Parker learned, it's something harder. Miles doesn't learn about responsibility in the abstract. He learns it through a specific failure, a specific moment of cowardice, a specific person he couldn't save. That wound follows him through every run. The best Miles stories always come back to it. But the single greatest thing Bendis ever wrote with this character is the Prowler arc. When Uncle Aaron discovers that Miles is Spider-Man, he doesn't turn him in, he uses it. He threatens to expose Miles unless his nephew uses his powers to support criminal operations. Think about what that does to a 13-year-old. Betray your values or destroy your family. Those are the only two options on the table. The confrontation that ends that arc is one of the most emotionally complete things in Miles Morales' entire comic history. No crossover event stealing the spotlight, no cosmic threat pulling the camera away, just two people who love each other with no good options and consequences that feel real. Bendis gave that arc room to breathe, and it shows. What made this run work wasn't the powers or the costume, it was the family. Genki Lee is one of the great best friend characters in all of Marvel. Enthusiastic where Miles is anxious, loud where Miles is quiet, the kind of person who makes every scene he's in more alive. Miles' mother, Rio, is warm and sharp and exactly the parent you'd want in your corner. And his father, Jefferson, who distrusts Spider-Man without knowing his son is underneath the mask, creates a dramatic irony the book never stops paying off. Everything about this universe was working. Here's the thing though, Marvel looked at it all, everything Bendis had built, everything that was working, and made a decision that, from a standpoint, probably made total sense. And from a storytelling standpoint, kind of broke the character in a way he's still recovering from. In 2015, Marvel ran a massive crossover event called Secret Wars that reset their entire publishing line. The Ultimate Universe, where Miles had lived since 2011, was destroyed as part of that story. Miles survived. He and his supporting cast were transplanted into the main Marvel universe. And on the surface, that sounds like a promotion. Miles was now in the same world as the Avengers, the X-Men, the real Fantastic Four. But here's the thing about the main Marvel Universe. Peter Parker is alive, active, starring in his own enormously popular comic. Miles was now the second Spider-Man. That might not sound like a problem. There have been multiple Spider people before, but understand what it meant specifically for Miles. In the Ultimate Universe, he was the only Spider-Man. There was no shadow to stand in, no comparison to invite, no question of legitimacy hovering over every panel. In the main universe, he became a legacy character, someone constantly in dialogue with a more famous version of himself. Every time Miles appeared on a page, an unspoken question followed him. Why does this universe need two Spider-Men? What is Miles here for that Peter isn't already covering? I remember reading Bendis' 616 run for the first time and waiting, genuinely waiting for the moment that question got answered. The moment where Miles did something that made his presence in this universe feel inevitable, and it never quite came. There's great material in this run. The relationship between Miles and his father deepens in ways that feel genuinely earned. Jefferson slowly coming to terms with his son being Spider-Man, loving him anyway despite everything. That's some of the most emotionally honest superhero writing you'll find from this era. But the book is also constantly being yanked into crossover events. Civil War II gives Miles a prophetic vision of himself killing Captain America, genuinely dark, genuinely interesting, and then drops it off without satisfying payoff. Secret Empire does the same thing. Bendis is a great writer who was handed a structural problem no amount of great writing could fully solve. Bendis eventually left Marvel in 2017 after 7 years with this character, and I want to be fair to him, Miles is genuinely better developed at the end of that run than he was at the beginning. The family dynamics are richer, the supporting cast is deeper, he's a more complete character, but the fundamental question, what is Miles here for in a universe that already has Peter Parker? That question was still hanging in the air when Bendis walked out the door. And the writer who picked it up next came in at the most exciting possible moment, which unfortunately also turned out to be something of a trap. December 2018. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse opens in theaters and immediately becomes a cultural phenomenon. Miles Morales is suddenly the most famous superhero in the world. And the same month, the exact same month, a new Miles Morales comic launches with writer Saladin Ahmed. Fresh energy, new direction. If there was ever a moment for a definitive run to happen, this was it. Ahmed's Miles is immediately different from Bendis's in ways that feel like growth rather than contradiction. Where Bendis wrote Miles as perpetually uncertain and reactive, Ahmed writes him as a teenager actively learning confidence. He's funnier in this run, he has opinions, he's allowed to be sarcastic and stubborn, and a little annoyed in ways that feel true to how real teenagers actually talk. That shift in voice makes him more charismatic and more alive. But the reason this run matters, the reason I think it's the most important Miles Morales comic since the original Ultimate run, and actually my favorite, at least the start of Ahmed's run, is how he approached the villain work. He introduced a character called the Assessor, a cold clinical antagonist who captures Miles and subjects him to psychological testing, treats him like a lab specimen, tries to quantify him. And the question the Assessor is really asking is, who is Miles Morales when you strip everything away? His powers, his name, his relationships, what's left? That's the perfect villain for this specific character because the question Miles himself has been trying to answer since 2011. And then there's the Tombstone arc, a contained street-level story, Miles protecting his neighborhood from organized crime. Small, scale, specific setting, no universe-ending threat. No Avengers showing up to help him. Just a kid from Brooklyn trying to do right by the people around him. I went back and read those issues twice. They're that good. The kind of good where you close the book and immediately want to tell someone about it. It's not the definitive run, not because of the ability that's lacked there, he clearly had it, but because Marvel couldn't leave the book alone long enough to let him build something that lasted. Absolute Carnage arrived, then King in Black, then tie-in after tie-in. By the midpoint of the run, Miles was spending more time inside Marvel's event machine than in his own story. Ahmed handled the interruptions with more grace than most writers would, but the cumulative damage was real. Every buried plot thread caused issues to excavate. The momentum that the early run built just bled away, and by the time he finished, what could have been the definitive Miles Morales run was instead the clearest possible proof that the system around him is broken. And I really loved the start of that run, but it just fizzled out in a way that I can't recommend it as the best run. And look, I've been pretty careful up to this point to lay evidence before I make arguments, so I want to do that one more time here because what I'm about to say is going to land wrong if it sounds like I'm just venting. I'm not venting. I went back through all of this specifically because I wanted to know if the take I'm about to give you is actually supportable, and I think it is. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse did more for Miles Morales in 2 hours than Marvel Comics managed in 14 years of monthly issues. And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I'm being reductive or like I'm doing that thing where someone who loves movies condescends to comics. I'm not doing that. I've spent weeks going through this material. I love what comics can do that movies can't even attempt. But what the Spider-Verse filmmakers had that no Miles Morales comic writer has ever been given is just an ending, a complete arc. Nobody called them in the third act and said, hey, we need Miles to go fight Carnage for 6 issues before you can wrap this up. They got to build something with a beginning, a middle, and an actual resolution. And the result is a version of Miles Morales with a clearer emotional identity than anything in his entire published comic history. That final image of him leaping off the building, you know exactly who he is in that moment. You can name what he believes and why he believes it. I've been reading Miles Morales comics for years, and I'm still not sure I could do that for the current version with the same confidence. That gap shouldn't exist. It especially shouldn't exist after 14 years. And the reason it does exist isn't because the comic writers are less talented than the filmmakers. Bendis and Ahmed are genuinely gifted. The reason is that Marvel keeps using Miles's books as a crossover delivery vehicle instead of a place where a character gets to grow. And at some point, that stops being a series of unfortunate circumstances and starts being a choice. I think we're well past that point. Now, the current Miles Morales book, or the most recent, was Cody Ziglar. He took over in late 2022. He's younger than Bendis or Ahmed, closer in generation to the audience Miles is meant to represent, and that closeness shows in the energy and the rhythm of the book. His partnership with artist Federico Vincentini gives it a visual energy that suits Miles better than any art style he had since Sarah Pichelli's original work in the early Bendis years. The book feels fast and alive in a way that matches who this character actually is. What I keep coming back to in Ziglar's run is something that sounds small but actually changes the whole read. He writes Miles like Miles has already won the argument. Like the question of whether he deserves to be Spider-Man just isn't interesting anymore, because the answer is an obvious yes. For a character who spent years being written with this low-grade anxiety underneath everything, like he had to keep re-earning the right to his name, that shift is genuinely noticeable. Miles in this run gets to just be the guy. He can be wrong, he can struggle, he can have a bad day without any of it feeling like evidence in the case against him wearing the costume. That sounds like a low bar, and it kind of is, but it's a bar that the book hadn't consistently cleared before, and clearing it changes what the rest of the story gets to be about. Yes, Ziglar's very first arc dropped Miles directly into a Carnage crossover because of course it did, but he used the event instead of being used by it. He found ways to test Miles' character inside the chaos that felt intentional rather than obligatory, and in the issues that followed, he began building villains who feel like they belong to Miles specifically, not borrowed from Peter Parker's mythology, not imported from another title. That's been one of the chronic missing pieces in the character's history. Ziglar built it. Now, it's too early to call this the definitive run. The history of this character gives you every reason to be skeptical, but the early signs are very encouraging in ways that earlier runs weren't. If Marvel gives Ziglar the editorial protection that Bendis and Ahmed were denied, the freedom to stay in Brooklyn, to say no to crossovers, to develop a rogues gallery over years without interruption, this could become what every other run was reaching for. That's a big if, but for the first time in a long time, the if feels worth hoping for. So does Miles Morales have a definitive comic book run? The closest thing is Bendis' original Ultimate Comics from 2011. That's still the clearest statement of who Miles is and why he matters. If you're going to start somewhere, start there. The Prowler arc alone is worth the price of admission. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I didn't expect to find when I started going through all this. Miles Morales has always been a character defined by what happens after your world falls apart. His uncle betrayed him, his mother died. His entire universe was literally destroyed by a company decision. And every single time, he put the mask back on and went back to Brooklyn anyway. The comics did the same thing to him that life does to most of us. They kept interrupting his story before he could finish it, kept moving the goalposts, kept pulling him into someone else's crisis before he could resolve his own, and he kept going. Maybe that's not a failure of imagination. Maybe that is the definitive Miles Morales story. We were just waiting for Marvel to give it a title, and the whole time, it was hiding in the pattern.